Mario Monti, Mr. Stepien, Polish Undersecretary of State for Infrastructure, Mr. Martin Verwey from DG Economic, Mr. Paquet, Director of DG Transport, Mr. Parsons from Macquarie Infrastructure, and Mrs. Muriel, Managing Director at Moody's. And we are waiting also for Commissioner Oettinger, who will join us in a couple of minutes. This conference is the third in a row organized by ALDE Group with policymakers and stakeholders, and is anticipating the publication by the Commission next week of the new proposals for 10E and 10T financing and the new Multiannual Financial Framework Connecting Europe facility. And while we believe as liberals that it's crucial to adopt a transversal approach and have an integrated look on these proposals, we decided to have this consultation and prepare a paper for our members in order to support as much as possible the development of this subject in Europe. I won't go any longer, and I will ask the leader of our group, Mr. Guy Verhofstadt, to have the true opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dear Mr. Monti, dear Mario, ladies and gentlemen, and dear Adina, first of all, I'm very happy that our group today is hosting this important conference, because I think it's maybe one of the most pertinent questions that we can put today on the table, how we can finance in Europe major works of infrastructure. You could also put the question in another way. Can we afford not to do so? We are a strong supporter, as you know, of the internal market. And I think also that your report, Mario, is the blueprint for the future, which in our opinion, the European Commission should follow the closest as possible if we want to stimulate growth and ensure cohesion. But we think that for the moment, the European Commission is far too slow on the implementation of the program. The European Union single market is still incomplete, and I think that nowhere it is more clear than in the energy sector, where protectionism still exists. And if the Commission intends to be serious about its ambition to come forward with a common energy policy, then I think one of the key points of your report, the internal market for energy, must be opened up. For that, you need, as we know, an appropriate energy infrastructure which can help security of supply and reduce also our dependence on a limited number of suppliers, and that can also help to integrate clean energy and integrate this clean energy into mainstream energy supplies, and it will make the markets more also efficient and drive down costs for consumers. And I'm quite confident that Commissioner Oettinger will do his utmost on this within the Commission, as it is in his portfolio. But naturally, it's not only infrastructure on energy what is needed. We also need more basis infrastructure on transport, and transport infrastructure needs to be developed with a clear European dimension to ensure real interconnectivity between the member states, because it is on that element, interconnectivity, that lies the added European value. And for all these plans, two things are necessary. First, the political will to realize them, and then, secondly, and that is the topic of this conference, substantial financial resources. I can tell you that our group has an enormous political will on this issue. Recently, together with Alain Lamassoure and Jutta Haug, I published also a proposal on how Europe can go for growth by reforming its multi-annual financial framework and his budget revenues. And there is a cross-party consensus that the best way forward is more Europe, more integration, more ambition, and more common financing mechanism. It strikes me that in the face of the biggest economic and financial crisis the world has ever known, we have to recognize, if you look to the figures, that the European Union and the US have reacted differently in terms of public investment. In the EU, if you look to the figures, and that's also a file in the document on the new multi-annual financial framework, you see that public investment has drastically declined in Europe, while in the US it has greatly increased. So we have to take into account and try to find ways how within bad public finances, because they are bad in Europe, but in every member state of the European Union, you could nevertheless have common investments and find finances for this common investment. Just because that is the key question. How, in a bad public environment of public finances, where you find the money, where you find the financial resources to do that. And that is necessary to create growth, I think, also necessary not to fall in a Japanese scenario. You know, Japanese in the beginning of the 90s got also a real estate crisis, an enormous banking crisis, and it has taken for them 12 years to overcome this Japanese winter and to recapitalize, first of all, their financial sectors. You know that during the recent State of the Union speech, the President of the Commission, Mr. Barroso, have made a number of proposals. He has talked about project bonds. He has talked about EIB bonds, what already exists, European Investment Bank. He talked also about stability bonds. That's the new word we use for Eurobonds. So there is some reluctance with Eurobonds, so we now use the word stability bonds. That's what we mostly do in Europe when there is some problem with a concept. And I think that all these ideas are the right way forward to see how we can finance these projects in the future. But naturally, what we expect is that the Commission comes forward with concrete proposals and that we can start to monitor the progress on project bonds, on the Green Paper on stability bonds, and so further. So I'm looking forward, Adina, to the interesting debate today, bringing together policymakers, stakeholders, and I'm sure that the conclusions can help the European Commission, but also our group and the European Parliament in our work in the coming weeks and months on this most important issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Verhofstadt, for the introduction. Thank you, Commissioner Oettinger, for coming. So I'll take the opportunity already to give you the floor, because I know the time is an important factor. So, please.
Herr Präsident, lieber
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Verhofstadt, Ms. Valian, Mario Monti, ladies and gentlemen. With European energy policy, you can approach all of the goals, but you won't achieve them without getting the right infrastructures built. You won't be able to provide energy securely. You won't be able to provide competitive systems. You won't be able to provide reliability for the consumer, nor will you be able to provide energy securely across borders. When it comes to integration of renewable energies, for example, or trying to get active consumers that produce energy, not just consuming energy, these goals are pan-European. That's what we need, pan-European networks for the feeding in of electricity, for example. We need smart grids and smart metering to achieve those goals. If you look at the single market, and the single market is one of the core principles of the European Union, peace on the one hand and the single market on the other are the pillars of the European Union. The single market needs to have the capacity to be able to ensure transport, whether it's electronic goods, textiles, food, white goods, across our European motorways and across our European railroads, our airline routes, our maritime and inland waterways. We have to have an integrated, all-encompassing transport network that needs to work properly. Whether it's cargo planes, trucks, containers, all of these things need to be taken into account. If you look at the volume of products that can be transported from Riga to Lisbon, from London to Athens, and the same goes for digital communication and has done for some time. Mobile telecommunications, email, navigation systems. This is quality and capacity for transport goods and for networks. It's the same with the energy field. In the field of transport, as well as electricity and gas, we need a great progress in terms of capacity and quality. So for that reason, the internal market is important for provision of energy, as well as transporting our energy from the point of production to European cosmopolitan areas. So we need a sustainable, efficient network that will only be possible using smart grids and smart metering. Our forefathers built the roads, they built the railroads, they built the maritime routes. We, in our generation, need to spend the next 20 years ensuring that the energy transport networks are on the same level as we've already achieved with the roads, the rail, and now with digital communications. Over recent years, not enough has been invested in our energy systems. And at the moment, financial investors are circumventing the energy sector. They're avoiding it. So we need security when it comes to planning. We need long-term strategies for energy to ensure that more money is invested in energy in order to ensure modern production capacities that are low in CO2 emission, as well as ensuring that the production capacity is translated across to transport capacity, and that all translates into energy efficiency, meaning that buildings, industrial production sites can ensure greater energy efficiency through this investment. This is a topic which is only really applicable to Europe because this is where we have the single market. But increasingly we have more and more cross-border energy transport. We have offshore wind parks to the northwest of Ireland, and they have to then link up to the UK. There are parallel offshore wind parks, wind farms in the North Sea, and they have to then be fed into the grid through Norway. Then they can go through Rotterdam, Paris, Cologne into mainland Europe. This is a whole border crossing venture, and that's what we're working on. Over the last year, we set out our communication for cross-border provision of electricity and gas, trying to set out a provision for 200 billion euros to be invested in the sector. On the 19th of October, and by the way, I'm very pleased that you've organised this in such a timely fashion. On the 19th of October, we will be producing our proposed legislation for the building of energy infrastructures. And in that, we focus on 4 important areas. Firstly, how can we ensure the planning procedures and the approval procedures for energy infrastructures are speeded up? It's important when you think about large-scale energy projects that are taking 12 to 15 years. That's simply too long. China is not exactly a role model in this field, but they do show where the future lies. They have built 35 coal-fired power plants together with their nuclear power plants in the same period of time. They have mined the coal, sent it to the coal-fired power plant, produced electricity, sent it on to Shanghai, Hong Kong and so on within an incredibly short time period, within 5 years. Whereas in Europe, in my country, in Germany, the question comes up of whether the current power plant that already exists should be painted blue, red or green, and that's the major question that people are discussing. So our goal is to make procedures, the approval, the planning phase to take from 3 to 5 years maximum. And nonetheless, in that period of time, we need to make sure all of the legal considerations have been taken on board. Property protection, environmental protection, community investment, and so on. All of these issues can be taken on board and complied with, but the whole thing done faster. We want to make sure the authorities are bundled, so there's not 10 different authorities that have to be applied to in order to build such infrastructures. So in the European common interest, we should be able to accelerate the process. European level planning, which crosses borders, is what we're attempting to achieve. We have N2G plans, which involve partnerships, as well as ASA, a European level regulator body, and essentially it's all about money. We're looking at 200 billion to be put into a new electricity and gas network, and the major part of that is expected to be brought by the private market, by investors. That's why the internal market is going to prove essential. There's currently a separation between electricity production on the one hand and transport on the other side. That's what we call unbundling. The regulators have a decisive role to play there. They have to approve the price for the transportation of electricity and gas. That price has to be high enough so that investment in new networks is attractive to investors. Even if the market is going to bring the major chunk of that investment, we have projects which are important to our common European interest, but which are not profitable, which cannot simply be, the cost of which cannot be simply transferred across to the consumers, otherwise the price would be exorbitantly high. To give you an example, in Malta or Sicily wanted to set up an electricity production plant that has to then be transported across to Europe. The Baltic states, for example, if they want to produce in a competitive way for the single market on mainland Europe, they have to have a channel through which they can supply that energy to Europe, and they become dependent on that channel. To give you an example, Greece, looking forward to Croatia and possibly even Serbia joining the EU, even this connection there in the southeast through Austria and so on, if we want to connect Italy with that eastern region, all of these projects are in the common European interest, and they will require changes to the single market, and it's urgent. For that reason, we need certain European measures and resources to be made available. In the European Parliament in 2008, money was put aside into the European Recovery Programme in the light of the crisis. It was 2.5 billion euros set aside for the energy package. We drew experience from that. There were 60 projects that were co-financed with the money allocated at European level, and it was a very important decision that was taken at that point. And for that reason, I am very grateful for the fact that the Commission's proposal, which was approved in June this year, and which covers the 2014 to 2020 budgeting period, thanks to the work of the European Parliament's relevant committee with the chairman Jutta Haug, has been strengthened. And that means that 40 billion euros will be set aside over the next 6 years to 2020 to develop railroads, energy infrastructures, and the transport of energy. And there were around 10 billion set aside for the ICT project as part of that. And I would like to call upon you or rather, I'd like to thank you for having made that co-financing fund available. And it's important then in coming years for the capacity and quality of our existing energy networks through road and rail structures to be improved. Next week, we will be publishing the details of the budgetary resources that we are planning to make available through project bonds. This is to minimize risk, to give guarantees to the investors through the European Investment Bank, and how it's going to detail how more can be achieved through these projects, and that hopefully will garner your support. Infrastructures for energy are our priority, and if we are to adapt the single market appropriately, we need to make our structure stronger. If we are to build our capacity in the field of renewable energies from south to north of Europe, then we need energy to be transported and integrated into the large cosmopolitan areas. If we want to reduce CO2 emissions, then what we need is investment in modern energy infrastructures, and that's something that we cannot avoid. And smart metering, just a final point. If you have a look at your bill for mobile telephony, look at how much you spend on SMS, telephony, roaming, and abroad, and so on. All of that information helps you have a qualitative analysis of your bill. It's something that you spend once a month, 80 euros or so, and then you can pay on a monthly basis. But at the moment with your electricity bill, you have no idea how much electricity you're spending in the day, how much at night, what the alternatives are, what the competition is, and so on. If you saw, imagine if you were comparing that to other services, if you had one price one time and another price at another time of day, but you weren't sure when and what the alternatives were. It's important for consumers at home to know when they should be putting their washing machine on, when it's going to provide a burden on the electricity networks, and it's important for them to be able to change their electricity consumption accordingly. To use electricity when there's enough electricity in the grid, that means it costs 5 cents instead of 25 cents. So smart metering is an intelligent way to proceed. You as drivers on the road are intelligent. You'd rather drive a few more miles to buy petrol that's cheaper somewhere else, and you keep a close eye on the petrol gauge to make sure you can do that. But if you think of a fridge built in 2011, well, that uses a third of the energy that a fridge does that was built 10 years ago. But a fridge is something that is difficult to replace. But over 10 years, or 15 years, 20 years, this is the lifespan of a fridge, then you can imagine the savings that are possible. If you could change your fridge after 10 years, then you would be saving 3 years of electricity bills just through the money you've saved. So it's important for consumers to be able to read their bills and act in an intelligent way based on that information. From a European dimension, this smart metering requires a lot of investment built in with security, an integrated network. There needs to be solidarity which supports the consumers and makes it possible for them to act in an intelligent way. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. I already congratulated you today once at lunch for the presentation of your proposal, because I think it's pragmatic and simple, and I think it will have a lot of support in the Parliament and at the consumers, because it's a simple one by comparison with generally the temptation of Brussels to propose very complicated, and no one would understand the regulations. So thank you for this. I would like to ask now Mr. Mario Monti, who is the president of Bruni University from Milan. He's also the European chairman of the Trilateral Commission and honorary president of Bruegel, the European think tank. He launched in 2005, and he is the author of the report to the President of the European Commission on a new strategy for the single market, which was presented in 2010. So, Mr. Monti, how does look the internal market right now? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, Commissioner, Vice Minister, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to be once again at the European Parliament, and more particularly at the invitation of ALDE, your group, and President Verhofstadt. You are among the strongest and most enthusiastic engines of European integration, and I admire this effort very much. How is the single market today? Well, today there are other aspects of the European construction which concentrate the minds and the concerns more than the single market, but I think your question, Madam Chairman, is very pertinent, because the single market appears superficially to be something that is there more or less safely and works. But I would say that, first of all, it's not really there completely. And secondly, we should be very, very careful and watch out for what may happen to the single market in the years to come, quite apart from the crisis that we hope will be over after all. But there are tensions and tendencies in many of our countries to be more nationalistic, at least in economic terms, and the forces, the pressures, the enthusiasms for integration are somewhat fading away relative to the past. Therefore, I think an action is needed to strengthen the foundations and the daily implementation and credibility of the single market. The European Commission is, of course, with the support of the Parliament, at the forefront of this effort, and the European Commission is, among many other things, trying to implement through the Single Market Act most of the actions which are needed to this purpose. And I thought that Commissioner Oettinger's presentation, as well as, of course, his actions over these years, are a an extremely pertinent and forceful illustration of what still remains to be done and how progress can be achieved. And I very much share the objective that the Commission and Commissioner Oettinger have, and that this conference highlights of making improvements concerning the infrastructures for the single market. In fact, as someone who has worked for 10 years, like myself, mostly on the legal infrastructures of the single market, how to create it, how to expand it, and then how to make it competitive through the weaponry of competition policy, I must say that many times we took for granted something that was not granted, namely the existence of a physical single market. And it is equally, if not more important, to develop the physical dimension of the single market, and the infrastructures, particularly the interconnections, are at the core of this effort. And when it comes to the investment in infrastructures, I think there are very few other examples that can represent better than the investment in infrastructures economic operations that generate multiple advantages for the member states concerned as well as for the European Union. Because appropriate infrastructures for energy, for transport, for ICT and the digital really allow the European Union to be more competitive, to be more cohesive, more integrated. Then each of them contributes to specific and very important sectoral objectives. For example, energy security is sectoral because it concerns energy, but it's of course a prerequisite for a healthy European economy and society. And also investment in infrastructures contribute very much to growth. And here I would like to underline that it would be a bit superficial and not really convincing at this time of financial difficulties for everybody to argue for physical infrastructures, for investment in infrastructures, just as a means to increase demand throughout the European Union. So the Keynesian dimension of investments. That may be important, although one has to be very cautious in invoking measures of expansion of demand. It all depends on the situation, the timing, etc. But we should not forget that investment in infrastructures have the other side of the coin, which is even more important than the side of contributing to demand. They are a very powerful generator of supply in the future. And that is really the reason why, in my view, even at times of fiscal and financial stringency, investment in infrastructure should really see as one of the best non-inflationary, sustainable, long-term ways to secure growth, because it really generates supply, potential for supply of goods and services in the future, and that is much more important even than the ability to generate demand for products, semi-finished goods, and labor in the short term. So one does not need to be Keynesian. I don't think that being Keynesian is an offense, but I would like to underline intellectually that one does not need to be Keynesian to be a strong supporter of greater efforts in infrastructure investments, particularly if we have in mind this dimension of the physical aspect of the single market. I think that is particularly important, if I may say so, for the energy market, of which Commissioner Oettinger is the responsible and the driver, because as we had the opportunity to discuss, I think it was an informal energy council during the Belgian presidency, Commissioner, you may remember, the energy market, after all, has been and is being, because it's not fully there yet, a latecomer to the single market, because it's so close to national sovereignty, sensitivities, national industrial interests, etc. It is a latecomer relative to the single market for air transportation or for telephony. And should there be in the future I hope not, a nationalistic evolution in the way in which member states see their economic responsibilities, I'm afraid that the single market for energy would be an early lever from the single market, because the temptations there to play the national card, the national champion card, etc., are particularly acute more than in other areas. So it is, for this reason, even more important, in my view, to pin down the energy single market, to fix it on the ground, also through the infrastructural element, to make sure that it is really there. And here I would like to devote briefly the second part of my presentation to some reflections I had an opportunity to make after I left the European Commission, because one can and does reflect even once one is no longer, and maybe one has even more time to reflect. But I was for a while drafted back to service by the European Commission towards the end of 2007 until mid-2008, when the predecessor of Commissioner Oettinger asked me to act as EU coordinator for one of the cross-border energy infrastructural projects, the very high tension line interconnecting France and Spain, which had a very, and still has, but soon this will no longer be the case, a very, very insufficient capacity of interconnection. And that was, I must say, an extremely interesting experience. With the help of the European Commission services and of Monsieur Alain Baron, who is, I believe, here checking whether I say too many erroneous things, it was possible in 9 months to really do the job. This electricity interconnection was proclaimed since the Cologne European meeting, European Summit of 1994, as a key top priority for Europe. And this was repeated by the heads of government every 6 months at each, because the European councils were a rare event in those times, only twice a year, basically. But what can be the credibility of a European Union which repeats and repeats that something is a top priority and that makes no progress? So we took this as something that should not go along forever like that, and it was blocked basically for, I think, rather legitimate environmental concerns about the horrible change for the worse that the landscape over some nice and at any rate almost considered sacred mountains over of the Pyrenees would be brought about by this interconnection. And to make a long story short, also because I know that the time, particularly of the the Commissioner and the members of the European Parliament is very limited, it was possible to overcome the resistance, but in a costly way. I think there is no free lunch, Commissioner, and I think you are convinced of this, even when it comes to building Europe physically. And what was the way in which it was possible and technically feasible and safe from an environmental and health point of view to do this? Simply, although it was not obvious technologies, by deciding, well, by proposing to the two member states that a good portion of the very high tension interconnection should be built underground, which eliminated obviously the landscape concerns with their obviously important touristic consequences, as well as the health problems, because we propose that the interconnection be a continuous, and as I'm sure you are all specialists on the differences that there are as far as the health consequences are concerned between alternate current and continuous current, as I became for a very short while of my life. Now that is over. But of course, this was at the end agreed upon by the French government and the Spanish government, and accepted by the local population, but it cost money. It cost money, and the overall project is about 1 billion euro. But there was a considerable, there was a considerable portion of extra cost due to the enfouissement, to the underground nature of the line. And the Commission supported this. The European Commission put up 230 million euro of support, of unilateral disbursement, which covers a great part of the extra cost due to the underground, which was the only possible way to overcome the concerns of the local population. And because of the sound solution also found in terms of a joint company set up by the two electricity networks of Spain and France, the European Investment Bank decided, and I believe the contract was signed a couple of days ago, to make a loan of 350 million to the joint company. So I believe that this is a very modest but fairly good example of an action by Europe, by the European Commission, in order to overcome obstacles that keep the single market from actually rolling out on the ground. And I'm very pleased to see that in his recent presentations and policy documents, President Barroso now comes up also with a panoply of instruments to finance, among other things, infrastructures. I'm not sure that everything to acquire legitimacy in Europe should be transfigured and be given the label of stability. Otherwise, we will be in the most stable but immobile of all continents. There are things for stability. They are crucially important, but I don't think that everybody should be, everything should be rebranded stability to acquire the legitimacy to be discussed and eventually maybe even adopted. So I'm not sure that the stability bonds is, for example, the right denomination for that. And I honestly think that it would have been much more transparent, forthcoming, to call the Stability Pact without intruding in a not so convincing and at any rate ex post erroneous way the growth part. It was to meet political needs of the time of 1997, but I think it's perfectly possible to have policies for stability, policies for growth, and to combine them effectively. And above all, after these important political commitments made by the President of the European Commission, I think it's very encouraging that on the 19th of October, Commissioner Oettinger will present this very important initiative of energy infrastructure. And I will stop here. Of course, in the context of this conference, and I'm sure in the initiative presented by the Commissioner, there will be a special attention to the ways in which private investors can be attracted in financing infrastructure to complement public financing. And I happen to believe, like you, Commissioner, that the aspect of legal and economic certainty to be provided in particular by a stable framework of regulation may be much more important than any public subsidies. But there are here operators from the private sector who I'm sure will speak to that point as well. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Monti. Already a couple of issues were raised. I would like to encourage our colleagues and the participants to address a couple of questions to our first panelists. Mr. Goodmanis, member of ALDE.
Thank you. I'll try to put in German, how it's not so easy. English wasn't very good. Sehr geehrter Herr Kommissar, ich habe ein
Commissioner, I have a question about projects, the projects that you spoke about, the 60 projects with 2.5 billion euros behind them. Now, the present projects, I think, are going to be completed, but my question is about a link plan between Sweden and Lithuania. There isn't all that much cooperation on electricity grid interconnections. And there's a problem because on the Swedish side, everything is being built on commercial terms. It has to be profitable, in other words. Meanwhile, on our side, on the Baltic side, there are only two purposes. One is security of supply, because the Russian cable to the Baltic states is not in that good a condition. There's only one cable, and the Russian side needs more investment. So my question is this: is that project actually alive or not? And then the second question is this: in the good times, Deutsche Bank was doing project financing through a consortium of banks. But what we're asking now is how can this 40 billion be reached without some kind of private participation? Because it won't be between Europe and the public sector. Thank you very much, Mrs. Geisner. Thank you, Commissioner. There's one point I have to correct. We haven't got the correct connections across the board in transport, because we've got roads, all right, but we haven't got railways, so we do need to finance those. Now, energy policy. As a German commissioner, you'll know that in Germany we have a very ambitious energy plan now from the government, which requires investment in infrastructure. So the German state is going to have to do it itself. But the question is, you keep saying electricity doesn't stop at the border, but if there's no infrastructure, it does stop at the border. So what is going to happen if there isn't any European assistance? this Germany is not just a large state, but also a centrally placed one. And if something like this has been started up to store energy offshore, for example, it would be sensible to carry it on, even without European help. And then second question to Mr. Monti. From what Commissioner Oettinger said, and you said, he spoke about speeding up acceptance procedures, planning permissions. If we could come down to 3 years instead of 5, that would be nice. But in Europe, of course, also I always think about in Germany, we have a highly democratic culture bringing a lot of protests. Commissioner Monti, you said that very often there are protests against power cables, and these are obstacles which have to be overcome somehow. But have you got best practice examples about how to get acceptance among people of this kind of infrastructure which they might protest against or even strike against? Because all this kind of thing is necessary to get faster planning procedures.
And I will add my request, Commissioner, to say a few words about how is the Commission sees to overcome the separate protectionist policies of the member states towards energy and energy infrastructure. And I know you have in mind a couple of initiatives that the Commission could give more coherence to this policy. So would you please answer, Mr. Monti?
I have one question only, and a modest one, but an important one, Mrs. Meissner. Well, I believe and hope that in different ways all of our countries have a highly democratic structure that characterizes both individual member states and the European Union. By the way, the only vaguely international organization which has the basis of democracy on which to rest, that is your parliament, this parliament. I think to speed up acceptance of procedures, one has to work on administrative and legal modalities. That is one important component. But I believe that the most important point is to take the concerns of those who express concerns seriously and genuinely, candidly, and at face value. We came to work on that interesting doubly Catalan, both on the Spanish and the French side of the Pyrenees context. And the first thing we had to dig out and to destroy was a sediment of mistrust, because the population did not believe one word of what the local authorities and, above all, the electricity network operators were telling them. There was never a candid dialogue of the sort, yes, you have a point in having this concern, but number one, you probably are exaggerating your concern. Number two, it can be taken care in this way. Number three, if there is a non-eliminable part of the concern, we may find way to make you more happy on other aspects so as to compensate you for your loss of welfare in this respect. And this is simply the method that we followed. And I must say that at that point also those operators like the Red Electrica and the French network company played very faithfully at that point by our rules, did their job in a very constructive way. And you know, this is a confession, what left me and us most happy and proud at the very end was, yes, the signature of the agreement by Mr. Zapatero and Mr. Fillon, but even more, a comment made in the very last meeting in Perpignan, I guess it was, by the toughest guy of the opponents, who said, well, we must thank Europe because for years and years our respective governments have not really taken us seriously as an interlocutor. And I was thinking, my God, this is so rare that Europe is not seen as a superstructure of technocracy. This was a highly technical work, but I think that precisely to your question, how to speed up the acceptance of the procedures, I'm sure the Commissioner has more fully fledged and convincing answers, but I think that this commitment by those in charge matters enormously.
Wir sind mit den Netzbetreibern
We are always in contact with the net managers, and we have the European map divided up into 7 major regions. I mean, you come from Germany, you'll be interested in one of these major regions, which is Ireland, the UK, Norway, Denmark, Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands and France. And we talk with the grid managers and the governments about planning and the decisions to be made on interconnectors and the performance of those interconnectors. Same applies in the case of the Baltic states, Poland, Kaliningrad and Russia, plus Finland and Sweden. And we hope within a foreseeable future we can have a European planning map. And the managers have to work on the basis of transport fees, charges, and then they can work out a long-term financing plan on the basis of with outside finance. Or if it's not bankable, then they need to know how much they can get from the European Union. We then have to work very hard with our most important partner states, Switzerland and Norway, to bring them in. What's clear is that we have new technical possibilities and we have new demand. You can now transport electricity through the sea, which wasn't possible 10 years ago. With AC-DC technology, you can now, ABB, Alstom, GE and Siemens are the leaders in this, you can now transmit electricity over a long distance with very low power losses. 1,000 kilometers, you might have no more than 3 to 5% power loss. And there is one cable now between Morocco and Spain, only one. But if we can get electricity from the desert, then we're going to need, just as we have gas pipelines, we're going to need electricity pipelines under the Mediterranean. Or, for example, Malta, Sicily. There's a negotiation with the government in Rome and the Sicilian regional government and the government in Valletta, so that in the next 5 years Malta can get electricity that way. And in the Baltic, I think that this kind of undersea cable would be a good thing. And it's being talked about in our BMIP working party. Now, there's a very important point. The grids used to be like spiders' webs in the past. It was a one-way. You had a river, for example, and you dammed it, and with hydroelectricity, and from there you had a power plant, and you sent power away in one direction from it, in various directions from it. But in the new world, it's different. Let me give you an example from Austria. At the moment in Austria, in the Großglockner area, we've got pumped storage reservoirs being built so that we can store electricity. But that's not where it's used, this power. It's used in Linz. So what you do is you build a cable from the power station to Linz, right through the Salzburg province. But they don't like power cables, power lines in Salzburg. They like opera. So what you do is that you supply the steel plant in Linz with cheap electricity, make a profit from that. Vienna gets some tax on the profit, and Vienna can use that tax then to subsidize the opera. You have to, it's a complex mechanism, but you have to be transparent about it. Now, of course, despite that, not everybody's keen on the new power line. There are people who still vote against it, just as when you build a road, not everybody will agree, but you still have to build it, or other kinds of infrastructure. But at the end of the day, with energy, there has to be a majority if you're going to be able to implement it. So you need a leadership. And the very last objector still has to be convinced. You have to choose the right course, of course, the right track, the right path. Sometimes you do an overland cable, or you can invest more in an underground cable. You have to balance things off. Because the smallest damage can still end up in a court in front of a judge. So what we're doing there in Austria is to store electricity for the peak demand times. Now the coal-powered power plant, which has been stopped, is better for the overall balance of the environment, for example, than the damage that the environment has suffered through the new cable. So you're affecting the landscape, but on the other hand, you're reducing the NOx and SOx emissions. So you have to get away from the focus only on the cable, only on the new power cable, and its effect on the forest or on the landscape.
Thank you very much, both our speakers until now. I want to salute and invite for the next panel the chair of the Economic Committee in this House, Mrs. Sharon Bowles. I will ask her to come and join us for the next panel. Thank you very much. And until Mrs. Bowles is getting here, I will introduce our next speaker, who is question mark. I don't have my program. It's Mr. Verwey from DG Econ. Mr. Verwey is, well, already working for a long time in the issue of the response to the financial crisis. He helped to create a consensus around the need of a coordinated recapitalization of European banks, and he's the chairman of the Euro Task Force on Coordinated Action. So I will give Mr. Martin Verwey first the floor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak here. Just on the introduction, to avoid any misunderstanding, I used to be the chairman of Task Force on Coordinated Action when I was working for the Dutch Ministry of Finance. but since a couple of weeks I'm working for the European Commission, and it's in this capacity that I'm here. Well, again, thank you very much for the invitation to speak on a subject that is actually very close to our heart. It's to the Commission's heart, and that is the Project Bond initiative. We have been working, or I should say my colleagues, because I was not yet in the European Commission at that time, but they have been working on this initiative basically since the beginning of this European Commission. It was initiated in the context of the Europe 2020 strategy, and it was well, it was actually introduced by the President Barroso himself in 2010. And before I go into the detail of what it is, let me just say one or two things about the underlying philosophy of this initiative. The underlying philosophy, I think one could summarize as follows. It starts very general by the notion that in order to create jobs, in order to sustain our way of life in Europe, we need growth. For growth, we need huge investments in infrastructure, and others have spoken to that already. Unfortunately, as a result of the financial crisis, both public resources and private resources for infrastructure are less abundant than before. So the challenge basically is to find a smart way to combine the public resources and to use public resources in a way to attract, to mobilize private resources, and that is the essence of this initiative. And I would say that today this is even more relevant maybe than it was when the initiative was launched or announced in 2010. So with all the risks to economic growth that are there, it is essential, it's crucial that investments in infrastructure remain on track and are expanded. So this by way of background, maybe just to say one or two things about what these investment needs are. I won't elaborate on that too much because others have talked about that also. But just for example, in the transport sector, considering the growth forecast in traffic between member states, which is expected to double by 2020, the investment required to complete and modernize a true trans-European network in the enlarged EU amounts to roughly 500 billion between 2007 and 2020. In the field of telecommunication, there the Europe 2020 strategy has underlined the importance of broadband deployment to promote social inclusion and competitiveness in the EU. And so it was stated, the intention was stated to bring basic broadband to all Europeans, and well, this would take investments somewhere between 180 billion and 270 billion. And then lastly, also in the energy sector, which is a sector which is predominantly privately financed, but there are investment needs of above a trillion in the period that I have indicated. The assessment is that it cannot be entirely financed from private resources. So also there would be a funding gap of around 100 billion. So we're talking about huge amounts of finance that need to be mobilized in the years to come to make happen, to realize the ambitions that were stated in the 2020 strategy. Well, now let me turn to the initiative itself. The objective is to revive capital market finance for infrastructure projects. And we hope that we can find a way, and the idea is to find a way to bring in institutional investors to make it attractive for those type of investors. So how to go about that? So what is the technique behind it? And I think it's useful to dwell a little bit on it, and I'll try to avoid too many technical terms. But one way well, a basic setup would be as follows. Let's consider an investment in a toll road. Typically, a project sponsor would create a vehicle, a project corporation, or one could call it an SPV. It does not really matter, but the project sponsor would put in capital in this vehicle, and then it would try to raise the rest of the money that is needed for the investment. Would try to raise it on the market by selling bonds. Well, certainly in the current market circumstances, there is especially institutional investors are looking for investments that can provide relatively safe yields, or relatively safe investments for a long investment period. And that's where the EIB and together with the EU can come in. They can come in to basically what one could call a credit enhance the bonds that are issued by this project corporation. How would that work? That could be done in various ways. For example, they could provide a subordinated loan to this project corporations. So this would create, in a sense, a layer between the capital investment of the private sponsors of the project and the bonds that are sold to the market, and the effect of that would be that these bonds that are sold to the market, they would be safer than they would have been without this enhancement by the EIB and the EU. So in other words, these bonds would have a higher credit rating. They could get a good credit rating. For that reason, they would be interesting for institutional investors, and in that way, one could mobilize large amounts of private finance for these projects that we think are so important, these infrastructure projects. To conclude on the technique, the EU and the EIB, they would have a credit or risk-sharing agreement amongst themselves to divide the risk between the EIB and the EU. For the EIB, it's also very important that it keeps its good credit standing in the market, so it cannot assume unlimited amounts of risk. So there would be a credit or a risk-sharing agreement between the EIB and the EU. Maybe important also for you to know is that the maximum risk for the EU budget would be limited to an amount that is specified in the budget. So there's no, there is a very clear limit on the risk, and a very transparent limit on the risk that would fall on the EU budget. So that's a little bit of the technique. I should say this is we're not starting from scratch. We're building on experience that we have gained with other instruments. We've had the loan guarantee for 10T, and this it's not exactly the same, but it builds on the techniques that were used back then. So it's well. So where do we go from here? And the first step is that the Commission will officially express its ideas on this initiative, and this is expected very shortly. Then the idea would be for this for the financial perspectives until this period, so until 2013, to start with a pilot phase. So to start in a limited way to gain experiences. This would help the market to get acquainted with the new instruments, and so we would start in a, one could say, limited way, but still we expect to be able to finance projects up to around 3.5 to 4 billion in this period. Deploying community resources, well, somewhere, and I cannot mention exact figures right now, but somewhere beyond to 200 million up to this period. So that would be the 200 million. So there you can see the kind of leverage, so the kind of multiplying effect that you can achieve with these techniques. So to put it very simply, with community investments of around 200 million, you could generate projects, a project pipeline of around 3.5 to 4 billion. So, and that is one of the that was one of the objectives to get more bang for your buck, so to say. So and then the idea is after the pilot phase to make this an integral part for the next of the toolbox, basically for the next period. So 2013 to 2020. So we are very enthusiastic about this initiative. It will not be easy. There are things that well, we need to learn. There are things to overcome, and we need. Well, so basically, what I'm saying, we can use all the support that we can get to bring this forward. And well, let me stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Wehrli. Now I would like to introduce Mr. Gordon Parsons. He's Senior Managing Director to UK Macquarie Infrastructure, and we'll know Macquarie Infrastructure. So are you convinced, are the pension funds going to invest in infrastructure in Europe, or is something else needed as a plus? Mr. Parsons.
Okay, thank you. First of all, can I just say, it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the opportunity to talk on this. Before I go on and explain who Macquarie are and why we have an opinion on this, first of all, let me go straight to the question: can we finance Europe's major infrastructure needs? We believe we can, or largely. Some of them may be unfinanceable, but largely they're financeable. But the key messages I'd like you to take out from this little speech, first of all, it's a question of finance and not vision. The vision is there, and the vision is very compelling and very inspiring in terms of what we want to do across infrastructure in Europe, but the money isn't there. So we have to get the finance side of it right. The second takeout I'd like you to take is that it's a question not of the public purse. The public purse will not be able to afford what we're trying to do on infrastructure. It's all about the framework you create and the policy and the regulatory environment. And things like we've just heard are very helpful, but they're helpful as part of a wider environment and framework that needs creating. Okay. There are huge sums of private sector money wanting to deploy into infrastructure. The question is, it's a competitive market, and Europe has to access that and create the right environment. So if we just go on to the slide on Macquarie, please, if we can just go back one in terms of who we are. So why are we worth listening to on this, I guess? Well, Macquarie is the largest infrastructure fund manager in the world by some way. And it got into this space first in 1998. It's an Australian investment bank, and some smart guys in Australia looked at a recession that was going on in Australia at that stage. The government were unable to fund various infrastructure projects, and the pension funds were coming through as a new concept, a new idea, and they had funds, and they were looking for long-term returns off those funds and had nowhere to put that money. So these guys linked up basically the pension funds with infrastructure and said the smart way to do this is for pension funds to own infrastructure assets, and that gives them the rate of return they want on a long-term basis. So Macquarie got there first. We're now the largest in the world, as I say. This is what we do in Europe, and I'm not sure if you can read the stats, but we manage just under 30 businesses in Europe with a market capitalisation of over $50 billion. And about 100 businesses globally with a market capitalisation of just under $100 billion. So we're sort of large. We are deploying global pension funds monies. So most of these businesses are owned by pension funds from across the globe. And again, I'll give you an example, which is Thames Water. So we sort of own and manage Thames Water, but actually Thames Water is owned by Australian pension funds and Canadian pension funds and New Zealand pension funds and Iberian pension funds, and we are managing it on their behalf. And it's a model that works. Thames Water every year is investing about £1 billion of capex every year in replacing its network, replenishing it. So that model is bringing that capex forward and investing in the solutions that are required for London's water's needs. Okay, so if we can then go on, please. So in terms of the question, as I said, it's not a question of vision. The vision is great, but the numbers are enormous. And you look at the energy needs that we're talking about, and when you read these papers and you look at those numbers, they are new investment. They're not talking to the replacement investment that's required from the existing networks that are aging. So when we look at these numbers in terms of the need, we sort of double them in terms of that's the investment that has to come in to achieve what we're trying to achieve in infrastructure. Therefore, it is way above and beyond the public purse of all the governments put together and the EU, way above and beyond, and we have to access private sector capital to make this happen. The good news is there is very significant private sector capital looking for a home. So if you add up pension funds globally and insurance companies globally, they are looking to deploy something like $65 trillion. That's what they manage. So just pause on that number and think of it in the context of where you are. So $65 trillion being invested by those companies. But European infrastructure is competing for that money. And at the moment, about 2 to 3% of their investment globally is going into infrastructure, and a subset of that is coming into Europe. So we're not only competing globally against other infrastructure needs across the world, but we're also competing in terms of sectors. Europe is having success in this. At the moment, there's something like 40 billion of new funds being raised as we speak from pension funds, global investment funds, pension funds investing in European infrastructure funds. Okay, so the money is coming in. Of the existing funds, ignoring that, they've still got about 20 billion unspent. So the money that is there waiting to be spent. So there's big sums of money coming in, but they're not really of the size we're looking for. So we have to move forward in terms of getting more money. That's all on the equity side, so they're people who are the project sponsors. Obviously, they will also try to raise debt alongside that, and we know the debt markets are hard. We can see the debt markets are hard, and the banks are having a very tough time. Our view, though, is that with the right environment, other forms of money will come in and replace the bank. So as we go forward, it may not just be the lending banks are providing debt finance for these projects, but other people, other institutional investors are providing it. And we can see projects now, projects we're competing for, that have raised finance several times over. There are 3 or 4 bidders involved with these projects, and they're all competing because they're good projects and they have the right features of what we're looking for. So what makes the right project? And the way to think about it is this money out there is looking for a long-term stable return. Low risk, stable return. That's what it's looking for. So if we can get the right sort of projects going, that money will come, and it will come into Europe rather than going into China or India or other places across the world. So when we talk to our investors, and we meet these global pension funds on a regular basis, asking them to give us more money, asking them to let us deploy it into Europe, when we're meeting them, it's the same themes that are coming through. They use words like stability, transparency. So the unbundling concept within the third package is terrific, right? That's transparency. We can sit there and say to an Australian pension fund, the European energy market is unbundling, and therefore there will be greater transparency of how you get your returns back from this. They're looking for consistency and coherence, and part of that is local ownership. So one of the things that scares them away is when a national government has a different view of an international project or a transnational project than the EU. So if you get in that situation, they just don't want to come near it. So the other thing they're looking for is reasonable returns. As I say, they're not looking for high returns here. They recognise this is long-term, low-risk money they're deploying, but they want incentives around that. So if they do well, if they invest their money well, if they deliver efficiencies, they want to share in the benefits of that. Okay? So that's the framework that we need to create, and if we can create that framework, we can raise this money and we can bring it into Europe. And then the other thing is that once we set up that framework, the politicians and the policymakers must resist the temptation to change it. If you have a framework and the money comes and then it changes, you will not get follow-on money behind that, because they're looking for a long-term stable regime. So I think my plea to the policymakers is to understand that this is about the private sector finance and not the public sector finance, although the public sector can help, like we've just heard. Therefore, it is all about the right regulatory regimes and the right long-term frameworks to attract the money into Europe, and we are competing for that money. And therefore, it's all about giving us the story that lets us explain to people why they're best deploying it here. Harmonisation within the third package of the regulatory environment, again, is a terrific idea. It needs delivering on, because people will want to see that happen before they deploy their money into this sector. So the money's there. I think the concepts are there. What it needs now is that environment to be created, and if so, I think we will be able to raise the finance. Macquarie in the last 18 months has raised $4 billion just in the last 18 months, and we're one player in this big market space. The majority of that has not come into Europe. It's gone into China and India, and you're competing on that global stage. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I will invite Monica Merle. She is Managing Director of Infrastructure Finance Group Moody's. And I know you were covering utility, infrastructure, and project finance sectors, and overseeing the ratings of companies involved in electric, gas, and water utilities and infrastructure in the region. And I know that you authored a number of rating methodologies for the UK water sector and other infrastructure sectors. So how does it look, the rating of what we are talking right now?
Well, good afternoon, and again, thank you. Like the other speakers, I would like to thank ALDE for the invitation to address the conference. My role, obviously, as representing a rating agency, is to give the credit perspective here after we heard the equity perspective. And you're probably pleased to hear that it's largely aligned. Just taking on the question raised by the conference, can we finance Europe's major infrastructure? Actually, going back to the basic credit considerations that a potential investor would make in considering lending to infrastructure? The answer ought to be, of course, Europe should be able to finance essential infrastructure. These are, you know, if the nature of essential infrastructure assets in high-income, politically stable countries with well-developed and robust institutional frameworks are highly attractive to investors, both debt and equity. Many infrastructure projects in this type of economic context and institutional context are economically viable and can be funded under user pay models. There's in Europe a wealth of precedents of fair and reasonable risk allocations between the users of a certain piece of infrastructure and the operators, the private companies that are operating it. And these kind of assets tend to, or can be structures, to offer, to present stable and predictable cash flows over a long term that can match the profile of investors' liabilities. Again, talking about institutional investors like pension funds and insurance companies. And also, often the way the users pay is through tariffs that are indexed to some sort of consumer price index, some sort of inflation index, and that's done to allocate the cost of the infrastructure fairly across different successive generation of customers, of users. These also mean, from an investor perspective, that these kind of models can provide inflation protection over a long period of time. However, having said all of that, a potential creditor to European infrastructure will still go back to the basic question of any lending decision, and that is the borrower able and willing to service the debt? Or said more, more plainly, who's going to pay and how for the investment? So, how has Europe fared so far on these questions? Well, actually, I would say rather well. The European governments have used successfully a range of procurement options for infrastructure, and they have complemented the direct procurement route, where you're using the public, the government balance sheet, the taxpayer-backed model, with privately funded model. Economic infrastructure has been procured using funding raised on the back of the future payments by customers and users under the private utility model and the concession model. And that has been quite successful. Incentive-based regulation that applies in Europe to regulated utilities, talking about things like the electricity and gas networks, again, under the unbundled model, or, for example, water networks, that has been developed in Europe and effectively adopted by many European countries under the umbrella of the EU directives, has become a global benchmark. We at Moody's regard many European regulatory framework as lower risk, for example, in comparison with a much longer established US rate of return regulation. And this might come as a surprise because actually many of these frameworks are relatively new, but again, are seen as exhibiting low regulatory and political risk because there's a framework of independent regulation with clear precedent, with successful precedents, and under the overall design of the single markets and I said, the principle laid down in the EU directives. And if you're interested, I've added to the presentation some slides on how we look at the European, the EU, gas and electricity transmission networks, which are clearly very critical in the debate of further integration of the energy markets. Also in Europe, we have the private concession model for infrastructure. for example, adopted in many countries to develop and fund motorways. And again, there's a very long track record, and the European concessions models have been adopted, have been looked at as templates in other parts of the world by countries that more recently have moved to use these models. Also, the public-private partnerships approach has allowed private funding to be used, and also, a degree of risk transfer to the private sector to finance social infrastructure. And all of these different models have resulted in very, you could call it bankable companies. The ratings, the credit quality of these entities, if you look, I might give you some stats in a minute, if you look across the EU, is generally investment grade and solid investment grade, which means investment grade is the safer part of the credit spectrum. And just to give you a data point, the issuance of bonds by EU infrastructure utility companies, which largely has happened over the last 10 years, represents about a third of the globally rated debt instruments that Moody's rates. So our infrastructure finance group across the world rates about 1 trillion euros of debt instruments issued by utility infrastructure companies and projects, and close to 500 billion has been effectively issued by EU companies, EU entities, relatively recently. So that's what has happened so far. What is the situation right now? Still looking good in the sense that credit quality and funding conditions remain supportive. Probably you can't see this graph. It shows the rating distribution of the EU utility and infrastructure corporates, and also the project financings that we rate, is still largely well into investment grade territory for the vast majority. And also the graph at the bottom shows effectively the cost of, gives one of the benchmarks of that indicates the cost of funding in the debt markets. It shows the yield for a group of euro utility bonds. And whilst during the financial crisis we have seen the spread, i.e. the risk premium that you have to pay if you go to investors and want to place a bond, that has gone up for this type of companies like for everybody else, but to a degree. But at the same time, government yields have been falling. So actually, it's somewhat surprising. Notwithstanding the financial crisis, the cost of borrowing for good, solid companies operating in the utility and infrastructure space is actually not particularly different, if anything, a bit lower than before the financial crisis. So a good environment to fund infrastructure. But, and you were probably expecting a but at this point from a credit analyst, there are some significant credit challenges. And clearly, we have seen a deterioration in terms of credit quality across the portfolio. For example, the number of entities that are rated at the bottom of investment grade in the BAA category has spiked up a bit recently. That is because now includes, for example, a number of Portuguese or Irish utility and infrastructure companies as a consequence of the macroeconomic stresses. And I think a number of other potential threats. So with my last slide to conclude, I would like perhaps to raise another question. Is the European economic and political environment becoming investor unfriendly? Macroeconomic pressures can lead to political decisions that damage investor confidence in fair, credible, and transparent policy making. In other words, there's a risk that the EU undoes a lot of the very good things that has done so far, or rather the member states in the EU. And I think it's clearly problematic if investor confidence is undermined and investors will look at what happens in a member state and quite often read across and assume that it might happen in other member states. So in order for this not to happen, what it is important, what is it that investors will continue to look for? They look for achievable and sustainable policy targets, and also realistic assessment of the type of risks that the private sector should and could shoulder. I mean, if you have a very complex piece of infrastructure to build that has, the construction takes many years, hasn't been done before, or when it has been done before, it has been very problematic, I think you need a very big balance sheet to do it. There's no way around it, whether it's a public balance sheet or a private balance sheet. But it still seems somewhat surprising that we continue to get questions on how we would rate a project finance nuclear power station. So that's clearly not very realistic. And also, investors will continue to look for consensual negotiated solutions among governments, the industry players, and other stakeholders when there is a need to adapt regulation or contractual arrangements. Now, as we said, we're talking about very long-term essential infrastructure. You design the framework, but it is possible that has to be adjusted because the world will change, the policy priorities may change, but there's a good way of doing this that could, again, make sure investor confidence is not jeopardized and other objectives are achieved. Clearly, if investors see unilateral government action without any consultation, without any broader agreement, that leaves the door open to years of dispute in the courts, that it's a classic example of when investors probably decide to take their money to a different part of the world, as mentioned before. And also confidence is needed that for these, I think echoing what has just been said, that if you're making an investment under a certain legal framework for the long term, the investor returns, whatever they turn out to be, they will not be impaired by discriminatory or retroactive action. In stressed economic environments, there's somewhat the risk that utility infrastructure companies, because they're quite resilient, because they probably continue to produce stable cash flows, they become an easy target, if you like. And that can clearly also scare investors. So, Europe can finance its infrastructure, but only if the plans are credible and affordable. And clearly what is needed is an alignment of policy drivers, procurement methods, and financing structures. And I'll leave it to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Even though we are running terribly late, but the discussion is interesting, I'm thankful to Sharon Bowles. She's the chair of our Econ Committee, and I will actually appreciate very much her thoughts on our debate. So, Sharon.
Thank you very much. Well, I've missed most of it because I was speaking in plenary, and I apologise. I'm going to have to rush off again, and I didn't know you were going to ask me to do this either. I'd just like to sort of share a few thoughts. I mean, the title of this is Can We Finance Europe's Major Infrastructure? And I guess if I listen to the last two speakers, the answer seems to be yes, we can. So why are we thinking about changing anything from what we're doing at the moment? So I might question why the Commission thinks we can't, and wants to invent a new kind of project bond. More broadly, I think we need to be careful that we don't just jump up and down saying project bonds as a magic answer to our current economic problems, you know, thinking it's some kind of panacea, just like the financial transaction tax. I think we have to be focused on how it's going to work. What is the project? Is it doing the right kind of thing? Do they help cohesion within the single market and growth? And obviously, if they're cross-border projects, you can help to bind together the single market. But I don't think you should do it with that as your objective. You have to make sure that during the lifetime of these projects, you don't find yourself in a regret situation. So you have to make sure that you're going into something for the right reasons. I'm curious with the Commission proposal on project bonds, just as I was when it was first announced, as to how it's going to fit together with the financial legislation that we're doing in terms of both banks and insurance companies now having to hold more liquid assets, it being, you know, quite difficult possibly for them to hold as much of some of these assets as they used to. How are we treating funds that are coming in from other countries? And in general, are we making sure that we're not going to introduce something that undermines other existing topics, such as sort of, you know, senior unsecured bonds that are already issued in you know, transport, telecoms and utilities? Now, if we decide that there is space for extra kinds of project bonds, you know, and there's a lot of enthusiasm within the Parliament, including in the Econ Committee, for these ideas that will stimulate growth, we have to get our targets right. We have to see how they fit with the legislation that we're making. It sounds very simplistic to say, well, along comes the EU in some form or another and takes the first lost tranche. What does that actually mean to the investor? Or what does it actually mean, many of you here might be thinking. But I mean, that's not necessarily a risk removal in the regulatory sense. You've still got risk in that project bond. So, no, I'm actually very interested in this because we're full steam ahead, as I'm sure you've heard Commissioner Barroso and Commissioner Barnier say. We have 29 legislative measures on financial services. How do these proposals fit in with those? Can you tell us, vis-à-vis the ones we've already got, like Solvency II, where we're going, vis-à-vis them with capital requirements? And obviously we're coming along and we'll be redoing the pensions funds and lots of other things. And it would be really quite useful for those of us who are actually having to do this legislation that is upcoming, for any hiccups to come to the fore whilst we're doing the legislation, because I mean the attitude in financial legislation is belt and braces, make everything safe. We don't actually want another financial crisis, and there is potential within that to create the funding crisis, and so I think it's actually quite important to explore what these interactions are, and yeah, that's what I'm interested in. I think that I have heard murmurings from among the investor community in some regard that some of the proposals also don't necessarily take that into account. But I'm sure the Commission has done a lot of work since their first proposal. But if you're just trying to make something that is a bit more risky, a bit less risky, and then take over from what monoline insurers used to do, you have to make sure you don't fall into the same trap that they fell into. Are the pension funds and others going to suddenly think, well, hey, you know, all our assets are a bit rather correlated. They're all in long-term infrastructure. I mean, there is a correlation in long-term infrastructures, even though they're different, in the same way that there was correlation in mortgages, but our regulators, supervisors, and many others thought that they were in different places, or some were commercial and some were private homes. They weren't correlated. So those are the issues that come to my mind. And yeah, I'm sure it's a good plan, but I'd like to see more about those things. And I'm going to have to be very rude and rush off, because I've now got to go and meet the College of Commissioners, yeah. and talk to them about how to get growth within a tighter regulatory environment, amongst other things like solving the euro crisis.
Yes, thank you very much, Sharon, for your considerations. Thank you very much for your considerations, and we appreciate you've been with us. There are issues raised. The Commission have to, it's just preparing the debate which will be in the Parliament. So, but before raising a couple of questions, I would very much want to give the floor for the rest of the panelists, and then we'll take the last round of questions. For the last panel, I would like to invite my colleague Gesine Meissner. She is coordinator in our transport committee, to join me in the panel. And I will rushly give the floor to Mr. Stepien, who is under Secretary of State at the Ministry of Infrastructure, Poland. And how is the presidency thinking to solve these issues with provocation with financing the infrastructure?
Thank you very much. Only a few sentences from the Polish presidency position. First of all, we welcome the Multiannual Financial Framework proposal. It keeps at very high level the EU support of the transport. It's really very important in this time, and of course we are very happy that it's ongoing during the Polish presidency. And the second thing is a new financial instrument, the Connection Europe facility. It will be presented in detail soon, and we are sure that it will be a very good point to discussion. We are still waiting for the legislative proposal for the 10th guidelines and the regulation establishing the Connecting Europe facility. We see that these two regulations together are very important in the process of planning, especially in case of the new investments. Mr. Monti said that planning the infrastructure is not a short-time planning, it's more than short-time effects. We think that we plan the development of the modern regions. These two regulations are really very important, how we can plan the process of the investment. Some sentences about the cohesion policy, very important for all over the countries, but especially, of course, for the countries like Poland and some other countries. First of all, more than 400 billion euro have already been invested in the 10th network. 1/3 of this amount comes from the EU funds. We can say very serious that without this money, some of these projects will be still on the shelves and wait for their chance. The main part of the EU support for the effective development of the 10th network has been implemented through the cohesion policy. And we see how it works, and in our opinion, it works very good. Over the period 2000-2006, 77% of the newly constructed motorways in the cohesion countries have been co-financed by the cohesion policy. 56% of all new high-speed and 7,260 kilometers of the conventional lines. It's really very substantial support. Of course, we can imagine how many of these projects will be on the shelves now if we are not able to find this money. For the programming 2014-2020, the Commission proposed 376 billion euro for the entirety of the cohesion policy, compared to 348 billion euro in the previous budgetary period. It means that we have quite stable level of supporting, and this is also very important for the countries who want to plan the investment. Now we see that the present TEN found to be replaced with the new Connecting Europe facility, and what is also very important, that we welcome that the sums committed in the new perspective for financing, this multi-annual framework, has been almost tripled. 21.6 billion euro compared to 8 billion in period 2007-2013. It's really very substantial support. In the end, some question about the discussion. We had a meeting in Poland in Sopot 1 month ago. We meet the ministries of transportation, we can share our opinions, we can discuss with them about the problems. The main subject was the public-private partnership, very interesting added part for the discussion about the mainstream of financing the transport projects. And the main axis of discussion is the very new instrument, this Connection Europe facility. Some opinions, some information which we note after this meeting. First, is the best solution to tackle the problem of financing basic infrastructure by creating a new instrument? Would it not better addressed in the framework of the cohesion policy? The second issue in this discussion was there is also a discussion concerning the transfer 10 billion euro from cohesion fund to this Connection European facility. It is not against the principle of reducing the administrative burden. And another point, the creation of this new Connection Europe facility should not have a negative effect on the cohesion policy. And the third point is there is a concern about the co-financing rate. The application of some co-financing rate is more prosperous the member state of the cohesion countries, which constitute an obstacle for the later to use the funds, as the national contribution would be too high, especially in the context of the debt level crisis. For some countries, these national contributions are really a very important problem. In conclusion, we see that continuation of the cohesion policy, as well as its effective coordination with the new Connecting European facility, will enable us to contribute to this and to the implementation of the strategy 2020, and to keep up the pace with the world's biggest economic power. We believe that these two regulation, we are waiting for them, will be really very good platform to discuss with all the countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Much encouraged by the presidency support. So, last but not least, Monsieur, I lost it again. Jean-Éric Paquet, Director of DG Move in European Commission, for the Trans-European Transport Networks and Smart Transport. And I know that since 2007, you started developing the Trans-European Transport Network policy. So would you please share with us some of your thoughts about financing the infrastructure today? Would you please, Monsieur Paquet?
Thank you very much, Ms. Valian. I think I mean, Mario Monti did half of my job in explaining how important it is to continue to invest in transport infrastructure, not only as a Keynesian measure, but essentially because transport infrastructure, the same goes certainly for energy and ICT, are the backbone to the internal market and are the basis for our competitiveness. I think one additional argument I would like to make very briefly is that investing in transport infrastructure, I think, is a bit broader than that. It's investing in transport, which is a source of growth, because in transport Europe is a world leader in terms of equipment. If you look at airplanes or trains, is world leader in terms of transport systems, if you look at signaling in rail, for example, and if you look at the operators in maritime transport, in logistics, in air transport, I mean, Europe is world leader. So investing in transport infrastructure, investing in transport research is an investment into the future and an investment for growth. But now indeed the question is, how do we do that? And how do we square the circle of these very significant investment needs which have been identified with the increasing constraints both on funding, public funding, and on markets and sources of financing? I think a lot has been said already, notably by my colleague on innovative financial instruments, so I don't think I should cover that. Just to say that, of course, the project bonds, which will be part of the Connecting Europe facility and which will be pilot tested until the end of 2013, in fact already have a predecessor in the existing legal setup, which is the loan guarantee instrument already in place for traffic risks under the TEN-T program. And in effect, the project bond guarantee is very close to the LGTT, covering, of course, a much broader risk basis than only the early traffic risk of a project. But in terms of then structuring and enhancing the financing of the project, the mechanism is pretty much the same. So we will enlarge the basis of LGTT to pilot test project bonds, and indeed hope that with that, not only do we make markets more familiar with the instrument, but also start working on a project pipeline, so that in 2014, when more significant amounts of EU budget is available to set up these guarantees with co-funding from the EIB, there is indeed a good project pipeline to use that instrument. And that brings me, I think, to my main point, which is that to finance infrastructure, you first and foremost need a good project pipeline. If you have a good project pipeline, and that's the experience, I think, as the Minister just explained, if you have a good project pipeline, you have funding, and in many cases when the project is well structured, in particular as most member states are now beginning to develop revenue schemes for all types of modes of transport, in that case you can find funding and financing. So the Commission, of course, is setting up the Connecting Europe facility. I will say a word on that in a moment, even if, of course, it's only in a week's time that the College of Commissioners adopts it, so I don't think I can be too, I should be too specific. But before doing that, the Commission is also proposing a policy and regulatory framework in form of new TEN-T guidelines to help project promoters, to help member states, to help infrastructure managers to organize their project in a European framework which should facilitate the design of the project and also allow project promoters across member states to better coordinate and ideally synchronize the timing of the investment. I think with this framework we will ensure that we have better projects. In addition to the overall guidelines proposal setting out the TEN-T core network with a time horizon for implementation of 2030, we will also propose to all parties interested to set up a limited number of coordination platforms along the most important corridors of that core network, so that on these platforms we can bring together, of course, member states, Commission services in the broad sense of the word, so DG Regio, of course, but also the TEN-T Executive Agency and resources of the European Investment Bank. And beyond that basic nucleus of coordination, We would also hope to convince member states that it makes sense to bring also their infrastructure managers, port authorities, airport managers, and also those transport operators that will in the end use the infrastructure, so that we can discuss projects along the corridors in various member states from the point of view of EU funding, of course, and the national co-funding of that European contribution, but that we can also identify what is happening along this corridor, including with national funding and where relevant with private investment, so that we have a long-term view of the projects being developed on the corridor, which I think will help them to synchronize and to be better calibrated. And at the same time, we also believe that if we get things right and if we get the innovative financial instruments right, we could on these corridors also help project promoters either come together, as explained, set up special purpose vehicles so as to emit bonds or maybe take loans, which could then be guaranteed by the innovative financial instruments, so as to complete, on very specific segments obviously of the corridor, not on the entire corridor, to complete the public funding, which will remain absolutely critical. So in fact we need a rather solid policy framework, the TEN-T guidelines. I think we need more effective coordination instruments, such as these core network corridors. And then I think we should continue to spend time, energy, resources to prepare the projects. And that will be done, of course, firstly by member states. Infrastructure policy is a national responsibility. Will be supported by the EU with a much more significant budget, so more EU public money in form of the Connecting Europe facility, 32 billion euros, and the transport component of the cohesion fund, 24 billion euros. That's together 56 billion euros for TEN-T infrastructure, which is an increase from 42 billion in the existing period. So an increase. On top of that, of course, we would expect that many regions and member states will also use appropriations under the ERDF. So here also there are various instruments in the EU budget which again need to be appropriately discussed and coordinated so that the projects which are prepared have solid investment strategies which make the best possible use of the public funding, but which are then also put in projects which are structured to attract on some components private financing, including with the support of the innovative financial instruments that will be proposed by the Commission and I hope supported by this House and by the Council. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to ask Gesine Meissner to throw a couple of questions, then I'll have the opportunity for panelists to react on what was said here.
Okay, thank you very much, Adina. Since it's already almost 7 o'clock, I try to make it as brief as possible. Well, I think several things have been said already. When Commissioner Oettinger at the beginning, he said regarding transport, it's possible to have connection with all modes of transport everywhere, and I corrected him. You should maybe not correct the Commissioner, but in this case, I think it was right. For example, you can't go through rail by rail through whole Europe. It's not possible. So there are some missing connections and some technical problems, and so we really have to look for a big investment in infrastructure in order to have a complete system, transport system in Europe. And a lot of money is needed, and just we had transport days, TEN-T days yesterday, no, not yesterday, last year in Zaragoza, and then we found out that we don't have enough money to finance everything we need, and so we have to concentrate on less corridors, for example, less projects in order to have things financed and finished. And that's why right now everybody is waiting for the TEN-T guidelines and for the core network, for the proposal of the Commission to concentrate on the most important corridors in order to have a good connection in Europe regarding rail and motorways of the sea and everything. And of course, money comes out of cohesion policy. That's something we need, and Europe is connected by transport, so it's really it's a European added value we have out of transport connections, and that's why cohesion policy is the right place to have the money out of it. But the Connecting Europe facility will be something very important as well. The biggest amount of money in this budget goes to transport, because really transport is the one who needs most. Although energy needs, of course, and broadband some a big amount too. And well, in contrarious to my colleague Sharon Bowles, who said maybe we don't need project bonds because maybe we have enough finances in Europe, I think we need project bonds. We do need them, and that's why I really think it's a very good idea to have a pilot phase for project bonds until the end of 2013, in order to find out how really does it work, how can we create other public, no, not public, private money, in order to have more in the pot, so to say, for the finance needs we really have for all the infrastructure. And that's why I'm really looking forward for the proposal. And then it will be, of course, heavily discussed, because not every single region will be in the core network. Not every project can be in the most important pilot project lists. So it will be a big discussion that will come, but we have to reduce our list in order to have it really finished. So thank you.
Thank you, Gesine. Now, brief reaction.
Yes, I wanted to maybe clarify some of my comments, and you have the strange situation of a rating agency defending the Commission, which might be. Very good. But on the point on the monolines, actually, just to clarify, the monolines haven't got into trouble with anything to do with European infrastructure. And I can say it because we've rated pretty much every single project that they guaranteed in Europe, and that portfolio of projects, which the majority were actually PFI, PPP projects in the UK for social infrastructure, hospitals, schools, roads, etc. In which, by the way, the good part of them, the EIB were providing a good chunk of the senior debt. So that portfolio has performed quite well, and if anything, the credit quality has improved, because these projects, over time, they complete constructions, and if that's, and in most cases, that went as expected, and actually we've upgraded their ratings. So I think, really not relevant to the debate. The only area where it is relevant is that, yes, there's plenty of money, but you need to create the mechanism and the channels for the money to flow. The big picture is clearly that the policy has to be right. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how much financial engineering or other things are done, the money will not flow. But the monoline model was based in exploiting discontinuities in the capital market. So, investors, they have institutional investors that have investment guidelines. So you would have a pension fund or insurance fund that can only invest in a certain type of debt with a certain profile of risk. And what you're trying to do with some of this financing technique is simply align the profile of the securities that are being placed with the requirements, with what the investors want. But the vast majority of the money will still come from the private sector, even in the... and also there are some really practical things like, and I think that the reference to the pipelines, if at the moment, without the monoline, effectively with bank lending, drying up for projects, in part also because of the changed regulations, there isn't a pipeline necessarily of projects ready to go to the market. And that means that investors, institutional investors, are not putting money into hiring people that can analyze that type of bonds when they see that there is a potential pipeline and that meets their requirements, that will happen. So I think we're really talking completely different levels of problems, but perhaps the Commission.
Yes, there are different approaches, and we can see it in the Parliament, because the experience behind each of us and the experience behind each policy maker. So that's why you will see, coming from London, or I wouldn't mention another capital, different approaches. It also has to take into consideration the currency and all the issues with regard. Please, brief, because we have to leave.
It will be brief, actually, because I think that answer was absolutely spot on. I think project bonds as an idea for de-risking projects, for projects that might otherwise not attract finance and bringing them in, great. If it's one of a few ideas that are coherent as a package, if it's one of a blur of regulation that isn't coherent, you're just going to scare the money to other parts of the world.
Well, I'm actually reluctant to take the floor after these comments because they have basically my colleagues on the left have basically expressed very eloquently what I was about to say. I would agree instantly that a consistent regulatory framework is key, and that project bonds cannot substitute for a good regulatory framework. That's clear. Nevertheless, I think project bonds can add, and I think a number of arguments have just been mentioned already. It helps clearly to get a bigger pipeline of bankable project. I would also imagine that just the mere presence of the EIB could also give comfort to investors, and that would help, and the EIB supported by the union, and that also would help to create more bankable projects. I just don't believe that it would undermine existing senior bond issues. I think, well, first of all, I think the market is simply too big for that to do that. But what you're actually doing is add additional quality to certain bonds. So which may not have been very attractive or attractive enough for investors before this credit enhancement, and after that become attractive for investors. So, and last point, I think and this also follows the question of the monoliners. I thought that implicitly there was a concern that this could create could have budgetary implications or implications for the EU budget. As I've said before, the way this is going to be structured is that the risks for the EU budget are capped. They are known in advance, and they cannot become bigger than the amounts that are provided for in the EU budget.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for staying with us so late. And I'm sure the debate will continue because we are just waiting for these communications to be put on the table. Thank you all very much.